In the late 19th century, New York City was a place of contradiction. Towering ambition stood beside muddy roads. Extraordinary wealth existed only a short walk from poverty. The city was expanding upward, outward, and inward, into the minds of those who believed that New York was destined to become the capital of the modern world. And yet, in the year 1880, one part of Manhattan was still considered distant, inconvenient, and almost rural. This was the Upper West Side. At the corner of 72nd Street and Central Park West, there were no luxury apartments, no cafes, no crowds. The park itself was still young, unfinished, and sometimes dangerous after sunset. Horse-drawn carriages moved slowly along unpaved roads. Open land stretched northward. Many New Yorkers believed this area was simply too far from civilization to matter. It was here, far from the fashionable neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan, that a bold and unusual idea took physical form. That idea would become the Dakota, a vision ahead of its time. The man behind the Dakota was Edward Clark, the head of the Singer Sewing Machine Company, one of the most powerful industrial enterprises of the era. Clark was not merely wealthy. He was visionary. At a time when most apartment buildings were considered undesirable, crowded, noisy, and associated with the working class, Clark imagined something radical. A luxury apartment building for the elite. Not a hotel, not a boarding house, but a permanent residence for New York's upper class. This idea went against social convention. Wealthy families traditionally lived in private townhouses. Sharing walls with neighbors was seen as improper, even humiliating. But Clark believed the future of the city demanded a new way of living, one that combined privacy, safety, and prestige within a single monumental structure. To bring this vision to life, Clark hired architect Henry Janeway Hardenberg, a man who would later design icons such as the Plaza Hotel. What Hardenberg created was unlike anything New York had ever seen. A fortress disguised as a home. Construction of the Dakota began in 1880 and continued for 4 years. The building rose slowly, deliberately, as if it were anchoring itself into the bedrock of Manhattan. Its architectural style drew inspiration from German Renaissance and Gothic Revival traditions. Massive stone walls, deep-set windows, high gables, iron balconies, a steeply pitched roof that gave the structure an almost medieval silhouette. Observers did not describe it as elegant. They described it as imposing. Some even described it as intimidating. The walls were so thick, nearly 3 feet in places, that sound barely traveled between apartments. Fireproofing was taken to extremes, using brick, iron beams, and stone instead of wood wherever possible. Inside, the Dakota was built around a vast central courtyard, large enough for horse-drawn carriages to enter, turn, and exit without difficulty. This design was practical, but it also created a sense of enclosure, a protected inner world hidden from the street. From the outside, the building looked less like an apartment house and more like a citadel, a fortress, and perhaps that was exactly the point. So far west, it might as well be Dakota territory. When the building neared completion in 1884, New Yorkers mocked it. The Upper West Side was still sparsely populated, and many believed Clark had built too far north to succeed. The joke spread quickly. The building was so remote, so isolated, that it might as well be located in the Dakota territory. The name stuck. What began as a sarcastic remark became the official identity of the building. Yet Clark was not offended. He understood something others did not. Cities grow toward ambition, and the Dakota was built with ambition embedded into every stone. The apartments inside were enormous by 19th century standards, some exceeding 20 rooms. They featured fireplaces, private servant quarters, formal dining rooms, and advanced ventilation systems. Elevators, still a novelty, carried residents upward in quiet efficiency. This was not a place for the average citizen. It was a residence designed for permanence, discretion, and power, a carefully chosen population. From the very beginning, the Dakota was selective. Clark himself lived in the building, setting the tone for its future. Potential residents were screened. Artists, industrialists, musicians, and members of old New York families were welcomed, but only if they met strict standards of wealth and reputation. Actors were not allowed. Musicians were viewed with suspicion. Public scandal was unacceptable. The Dakota was intended to be a sanctuary for the elite, protected not only by stone walls, but by social boundaries. This exclusivity would later become one of the building's defining characteristics, and one of the reasons it remains so insulated from the chaos of the city around it. But even in these early years, something about the Dakota felt different. Visitors spoke of an unusual silence inside. The thick walls absorbed sound in a way that felt unnatural. The long corridors, dimly lit by gas lamps, seemed to stretch endlessly. At night, the courtyard echoed faintly, amplifying footsteps and whispers. Some residents felt comforted by the building's solidity. Others felt watched. Death before completion. Edward Clark never truly lived to see the Dakota thrive. He suffered a stroke during construction and died in 1882, 2 years before the building was completed. His death cast a shadow over the project, fueling rumors and speculation. In an era already fascinated by spiritualism, seances, and the afterlife, some whispered that Clark's presence never fully left the building. These were, of course, only rumors, but they found fertile ground in a structure that already felt ancient the moment it was finished. The Dakota opened officially in 1884. By then, it was already more than a building. It was a statement, a building that did not belong to its time. As New York exploded into the 20th century, electric lights replacing gas lamps, automobiles replacing horses, the Dakota remained strangely unchanged. It did not chase trends. It did not modernize aggressively. It stood still. While skyscrapers began to rise downtown, the Dakota remained grounded, heavy, and resistant to change. It looked backward even as the city rushed forward. This resistance would later contribute to its survival. When many historic buildings were demolished in the name of progress, the Dakota's prestige and protected status kept it standing. But in these early years, no one could have predicted the building's future. No one could have known that it would become a silent witness to extraordinary talent, unimaginable wealth, cultural transformation, and one of the most infamous crimes in modern history. For now, it was simply a fortress on the edge of the city. By the closing years of the 19th century, New York City was no longer merely growing. It was transforming. Steel replaced stone. Electricity replaced gaslight. And fortunes were made and lost at unprecedented speed. Yet behind the massive walls of the Dakota, time moved differently. While the city outside grew louder, faster, and more chaotic, life inside the building remained deliberate, controlled, and strangely insulated from the modern world taking shape just beyond its gates. The Dakota was not simply a residence. It was a private society disguised as architecture, a world carefully curated. From its earliest years, the Dakota's board exercised extraordinary control over who could live within its walls. This was not unusual for luxury buildings at the time, but the Dakota took selectivity to an extreme. Prospective residents were investigated not only for wealth, but for character, reputation, and social standing. Backgrounds were examined. References were checked. Rumors mattered. Fame alone was not enough. In fact, fame was often a liability. Actors were considered unreliable. Public performers were believed to invite scandal. Even successful musicians faced resistance, viewed as unpredictable or morally questionable. The building favored industrialists, financiers, publishers, and families with established lineage, people whose names carried weight, but not headlines. This exclusivity created a rare environment in New York, a community of powerful individuals who were accustomed to being in control and who expected privacy above all else. Inside the Dakota, doors closed softly, voices remained low, servants moved discreetly, and personal lives stayed hidden. At least, that was the intention. Life inside the fortress. The apartments themselves were extraordinary. Unlike modern apartments designed for efficiency, the Dakota's residences were designed for ritual. There were formal dining rooms meant for hosting lavish dinners, libraries for quiet contemplation, and multiple fireplaces that served as both sources of warmth and symbols of refinement. Bedrooms were large, ceilings high, and hallways long enough to feel ceremonial. Servants lived on site, often using separate staircases and corridors designed to keep them invisible. Daily life unfolded with a rhythm that echoed the traditions of European aristocracy rather than the restless energy of American capitalism. Children were raised quietly, guests were received selectively, and the outside world was kept at a respectful distance. Residents entered through the grand archway on 72nd Street, passing beneath stone towers that cast long shadows across the courtyard. Carriages rolled in, paused, and disappeared again, leaving behind only echoes. Many later described the Dakota as a place where one could forget the city existed at all. But such isolation had its price: silence, distance, and unease. The same features that made the Dakota secure also made it unsettling. The building's thick walls absorbed sound so completely that neighbors often felt alone, even when surrounded by others. Footsteps echoed strangely in the corridors. Conversations seemed to vanish into stone. Some residents found comfort in this quiet. Others found it oppressive. Letters, diaries, and personal accounts from the era describe a subtle sense of unease, a feeling that the building was watching rather than sheltering its inhabitants. At night, gas lamps cast flickering shadows along the corridors, distorting faces and stretching silhouettes into unfamiliar shapes. The central courtyard, meant as a symbol of openness, often felt like a well, sound traveling upward, but never outward. Rumors began to circulate, stories of doors opening on their own, of footsteps in empty hallways, of cold drafts in rooms where no windows were open. There was no evidence of anything supernatural, but in an era obsessed with spiritualism, such stories found eager listeners. And the Dakota's reputation slowly began to shift, a building apart from the city. As the Upper West Side developed, the Dakota remained visually and culturally distinct. New apartment buildings began to appear nearby, lighter in design, more modern, more welcoming. But the Dakota did not adapt. It stood apart, its medieval silhouette increasingly out of place against the evolving skyline. This difference only enhanced its mystique. To some, it represented old New York, a city of restraint, tradition, and inherited power. To others, it looked like a relic, stubbornly resisting progress. Yet despite criticism, demand to live there did not decline. On the contrary, the building's refusal to change became its greatest asset. In a city constantly reinventing itself, the Dakota promised something rare: continuity. Generations of families passed through its apartments. Children who grew up behind its walls later returned as adults. The building became a vessel for memory, a place where personal histories layered themselves quietly, year after year. But not all of those histories were peaceful. Early tragedies and private losses. Long before the Dakota became associated with public tragedy, it bore witness to private grief. Residents died quietly in their apartments, as was common in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Illnesses claimed lives. Accidents occurred. Funerals passed discreetly through the courtyard, carriages moving slowly beneath the stone arch. These deaths rarely made newspapers, but they left traces. Rooms where lives ended were often redecorated or reassigned, but the sense of presence lingered, at least in the minds of those who believed such things mattered. In tightly controlled communities, grief had little space to express itself openly. It stayed behind closed doors. Over time, stories accumulated, each retold with slight exaggeration, each layered atop the last. The building's silence allowed imagination to fill the gaps. By the early 20th century, the Dakota had become more than a residence. It had become a legend, spoken of in careful tones, respected, but never fully understood. Artists at the gates. Ironically, as the cultural landscape of New York evolved, the Dakota slowly began to attract exactly the kind of residents it once rejected. Artists, writers, musicians, creative figures who valued privacy but also carried public identities. This shift did not happen easily. The board remained cautious, often rejecting applicants whose lifestyles seemed incompatible with the building's traditions. But the world outside was changing too quickly to ignore. Art, once considered unstable, was becoming influential. Cultural capital began to rival financial power. And the Dakota, whether it liked it or not, found itself standing at the intersection of old money and new fame. This tension would define the building's next era. The fortress that once protected residents from the city was about to become one of the most visible addresses in America. And with visibility came vulnerability, the calm before the storm. By the mid-20th century, the Dakota had survived economic crashes, social upheaval, and the relentless march of modernization. It remained physically unchanged, but the city around it was no longer the same. Traffic roared past its gates. Central Park transformed into a symbol of urban life, and the world began paying attention to who lived behind those walls. The Dakota was no longer just a home. It was a symbol of permanence in a temporary world, of silence in a city of noise, of privacy in an age that increasingly demanded exposure. What no one could foresee was how violently that privacy would one day be shattered. Not by decay, not by demolition, but by a single moment that would forever bind the Dakota to tragedy. By the early 1970s, New York City had entered a new and volatile era. The optimism of the post-war years had faded. Crime rates were rising. The city teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Streets felt louder, harsher, more unpredictable. Yet for artists and cultural figures, New York remained irresistible, a place where anonymity and fame existed side by side. It was during this period that the Dakota crossed a threshold it could never retreat from. The fortress that once resisted celebrity was about to become inseparable from it, a resident unlike any other. In 1973, one of the most recognizable figures on the planet moved into the Dakota, John Lennon. To the world, Lennon was a former Beatle, an icon of music, counterculture, and political protest. To New York, he was a symbol of global fame, choosing the city as refuge. Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, were drawn to the Dakota for reasons that echoed Edward Clarke's original vision nearly a century earlier. Privacy, security, isolation within the city. The building's strict policies appealed to them. No paparazzi roaming the halls. No fans knocking on doors. No casual visitors. The Dakota promised boundaries in a world where Lennon had none. Inside, Lennon lived a quieter life than many expected. He walked in Central Park. He greeted staff by name. He spent long periods focused on family and music, retreating from the public eye. For a time, It seemed the Dakota had succeeded in doing what it was built to do: protect. The weight of fame behind stone walls. Yet fame does not dissolve simply because walls are thick. Even inside the Dakota, Lenin remained a magnet. Fans gathered outside the gates. Photographers waited across the street. The building became a pilgrimage site, not by choice, but by association. The Dakota's board maintained its rules with renewed intensity. Security was increased. Residents were reminded of discretion. The building closed ranks. But something fundamental had changed. The Dakota was no longer invisible. It was now watched. And with attention came risk. December 8, 1980. On the evening of December 8, 1980, John Lennon and Yoko Ono left the Dakota for a recording session. It was an ordinary routine. Lennon was in good spirits. He had recently returned to music after a 5-year hiatus and was optimistic about the future. Outside the building stood several fans, including a man who had been waiting for hours. Lennon signed autographs. One photograph taken that evening would later become infamous. Lennon smiling, holding a record, unaware that it would be his last public image. Around 10:50 p.m., Lennon and Ono returned. As they approached the archway of the Dakota, the unthinkable happened. Multiple gunshots shattered the quiet. Lennon collapsed on the pavement inside the entryway. He was rushed across the street to Roosevelt Hospital, where he was pronounced dead shortly thereafter. He was 40 years old, a moment frozen in history. News of Lennon's death spread instantly. Within minutes, the Dakota was surrounded by police, reporters, and shocked fans. The fortress that once shielded its residents from the world was suddenly exposed to it in the most violent way imaginable. Cameras pointed toward its windows. Helicopters hovered overhead. Crowds gathered in silence across Central Park West. The building did not speak. It stood as it always had, unchanged, unmoving, silent. But its meaning had been permanently altered. From that night forward, the Dakota would never again be just a historic residence. It became a site of collective trauma, the aftermath inside the walls. In the days that followed, the Dakota's residents retreated further into privacy. Security tightened. Rules hardened. The board reaffirmed its long-standing resistance to intrusion. The building closed itself off, not only physically, but emotionally. For many residents, the tragedy reinforced what they had always believed, that the outside world was dangerous, unpredictable, and best kept at a distance. Yet grief has a way of seeping through even the thickest stone. Staff members who had known Lennon personally struggled in silence. Longtime residents spoke in whispers. Some avoided the courtyard entirely, unable to walk through the space where history had violently intervened. The Dakota absorbed it all, public myth and private reality. Almost immediately, myths began to form. Some claimed the building was cursed. Others insisted it was haunted. Urban legends connected Lennon's death to earlier rumors of unease within the Dakota. These stories ignored reality. The truth was more unsettling. The Dakota was not cursed. It was not malevolent. It was simply a place where human lives, famous and unknown, intersected with tragedy. But the human mind seeks meaning in trauma, and the Dakota, with its fortress-like appearance and long history of silence, became an easy canvas for projection. Films, books, and documentaries began to associate the building with darkness. Its image shifted from dignified to ominous, from prestigious to eerie. The Dakota did not resist this transformation. It endured it. A building changed forever. After Lennon's death, the Dakota became more selective than ever. New residents were scrutinized intensely. Media attention was actively discouraged. The building refused requests for filming or tours. Its gates became symbols of refusal. This was not arrogance. It was self-preservation. The Dakota had learned that visibility carried consequences it could not control, and so it returned, once again, to silence. Legacy of a single night. More than any architectural detail, more than any famous resident, it was that single night in December that defined the Dakota for generations to come. Not because it represented violence, but because it represented vulnerability. For the first time, the fortress had failed, and in failing, it became human. Long before television crews speculated, before internet forums dissected every shadow, and long before tragedy fixed the building in the global imagination, the Dakota already carried a reputation. It was not loud. It was not explicit. It was something quieter, a feeling. Residents rarely spoke of it directly, but visitors sensed it almost immediately. The building felt older than it should have been, heavier than its age justified. It stood like a relic from another century, unmoved, uncurious, and unwelcoming to interpretation. After 1980, that feeling intensified, and the stories followed. The birth of a myth. Urban legends thrive in places that refuse explanation. The Dakota did not offer answers. It did not host tours. It did not publish histories written for public comfort. It kept its doors closed and its interior private. This silence became fertile ground. Whispers began to circulate that the building was cursed, that something in its foundations was wrong, that tragedy was not incidental, but inevitable. None of this was supported by evidence. But evidence rarely matters when architecture and emotion intersect. The Dakota's design, its deep shadows, enclosed courtyard, and fortress-like facade, encouraged interpretation. Humans are pattern-seeking by nature. When confronted with silence, we invent narrative. And so the building acquired one. Haunted, or simply human. Stories of hauntings did not originate after John Lennon's death. They predated it by decades. Residents had long reported strange sensations. Rooms that felt inexplicably cold. Echoes in hallways that seemed disconnected from footsteps. The feeling of being observed, never directly, but persistently. These accounts were subjective, inconsistent, and impossible to verify. What was verifiable was the building's age and use. For nearly a century, the Dakota had been home to births, illnesses, deaths, grief, and isolation. People had lived entire lives within its walls. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, dying at home was common. Death did not occur in hospitals, it occurred in bedrooms. The Dakota had absorbed more human experience than most buildings ever would. To some, that accumulation felt like presence. To others, it felt like nothing at all. Cinema and the reinvention of fear. In 1968, more than a decade before Lennon's death, the Dakota entered popular culture in a way that would permanently alter its public image. The building was used as the exterior location for the film Rosemary's Baby. In the film, the Dakota, renamed the Bramford, was portrayed as a place of hidden rituals, malevolent neighbors, and unseen forces manipulating the lives within. The building itself did nothing. It simply stood there. But cinema has power. After the film's release, audiences began associating the Dakota with occult imagery. Fiction blurred into reality. The building's already unusual appearance made the transformation effortless. When tragedy struck years later, the connection hardened. People did not see coincidence. They saw confirmation, a reputation the building never sought. The Dakota never embraced its darker image. Unlike other historic sites that leaned into ghost stories or sensationalism, the building resisted all forms of exploitation. No plaques referenced myths. No guided tours recounted legends. No public statements acknowledged speculation. This refusal only deepened curiosity. Why hide? People asked if there was nothing to hide. The answer was simpler than the question. Privacy was the Dakota's founding principle, and it remained so. even as its reputation drifted further from reality. Residents and the weight of perception. For those who lived inside the Dakota, the myths were an external burden. Residents did not experience their home as haunted. They experienced it as controlled, quiet, and profoundly private. But they could not escape how others saw it. Friends asked questions. Visitors hesitated. New residents underwent scrutiny not just from the board, but from the public imagination. The building's address became a conversation starter, and often an uncomfortable one. Some residents resented this. Others accepted it. A few quietly embraced the idea that the Dakota was different, that it existed slightly outside the ordinary rules of space, time, and perception. Not supernatural, but exceptional. Why we fear what does not speak. Psychologists have long noted that silence invites projection. The Dakota does not explain itself. It does not modernize in ways that feel approachable. Its architecture does not soften with age, it hardens. Its windows do not invite you in. They observe. This design was intentional. It was built to separate, not connect. In a city that celebrates openness, transparency, and reinvention, the Dakota's resistance feels unsettling. We fear what we cannot interpret, and the Dakota refuses interpretation. The difference between darkness and gravity. There is an important distinction between darkness and gravity. Darkness implies intent. Gravity implies inevitability. The Dakota is not dark because it wishes to be. It is heavy because of what it has carried. Human lives, human loss, human significance. Buildings that host history do not glow with warmth. They compress memory. They hold it quietly, without ceremony. The Dakota's reputation reflects less about what has happened inside its walls, and more about how humans respond to permanence in an impermanent world. Myth as a shield. Ironically, the legends surrounding the Dakota may have served a protective function. The building's intimidating image discouraged intrusion. It kept curiosity at bay. It reinforced boundaries that residents valued deeply. In this way, myth became architecture. The story protected the structure as much as stone ever could. And so the Dakota continued, unchanged, watching the city reinvent itself again and again. Waiting for meaning. The Dakota has never issued a final statement. It does not clarify its past. It does not deny its myths. It does not correct misunderstandings. It waits, because meaning, like fear, belongs to those who seek it. In a city defined by motion, survival is an achievement. New York does not preserve buildings out of sentiment. It preserves them because they earn the right to remain. They adapt, resist, or become useful in new ways, or they disappear. The fact that the Dakota still stands is not an accident. It is a decision made again and again across generations. A landmark that refused to vanish. By the mid-20th century, Manhattan had entered its most aggressive phase of reinvention. Entire neighborhoods were erased in the name of progress. Historic structures fell to steel and glass replacements with alarming speed. The Dakota was an obvious target. Its footprint was large. Its location was prime. Its design was out of step with modern trends. Developers circled, but the Dakota resisted, not through height or modernity, but through status. In 1969, it was designated a New York City landmark, granting it legal protection from demolition or significant alteration. This decision was not based solely on aesthetics, but on cultural weight. The Dakota had become part of the city's identity. Not loud, not central, but undeniable. Living with history, not inside a museum. Unlike many preserved buildings, the Dakota did not freeze itself in time. It remained a living residence. People cooked dinners behind its windows. Children grew up in its corridors. Arguments were had. Lives unfolded quietly, without ceremony. This distinction matters. Museums preserve objects. Homes preserve experience. The Dakota was never meant to be observed. It was meant to be inhabited, and that is precisely what has kept it alive. The board, the rules, and the art of saying no. Few buildings in the world are as famously selective as the Dakota. Even today, wealth alone does not guarantee entry. Prospective residents undergo intense scrutiny. Personal history, public exposure, lifestyle, all are weighed. Rejection is common. Approval is rare. These policies are often misunderstood as arrogance. In reality, they are defensive. The Dakota has learned that attention is dangerous. Its walls protect not only privacy, but continuity. Residents are chosen not just for who they are, but for how quietly they can exist. In an era of constant visibility, the ability to remain unseen is power. The Dakota in the modern imagination. Despite its resistance to exposure, the Dakota continues to occupy an outsized place in public consciousness. It appears in books, films, essays, and late-night conversations. Tourists stop outside its gates. Cameras linger. Questions remain unanswered. Why does it feel different? Why does it command silence? Why does it feel aware? The answer is simpler than myth allows. The Dakota has not been diluted. It has not been renovated into neutrality. It has not been softened for comfort. It has not been explained into irrelevance. It exists on its own terms. And that is rare. Buildings remember differently than people do. They do not recall events. They retain pressure. The Dakota has held pressure for nearly a century and a half. Social, emotional, cultural. It has carried the weight of old money and new fame, of privacy and tragedy, of admiration and fear. Its stone does not express these things, but it does not release them either. That accumulation gives the building its gravity, the sensation visitors describe without words. Not haunted, but heavy with memory. Why the Dakota endures? The Dakota endures because it refuses to perform. It does not market itself. It does not modernize for approval. It does not explain its past to satisfy curiosity. It simply remains. In doing so, it offers a quiet rebuke to a city obsessed with reinvention. Some things do not need to change to stay relevant. Some things become timeless precisely because they resist. A fortress that learned vulnerability. If the Dakota's early years were defined by control, and its middle years by tragedy, its present is defined by restraint. It no longer tries to dominate its image. It no longer reacts to speculation. It allows stories to exist without engaging them. This is not indifference. It is maturity. The building has learned that meaning cannot be controlled, only carried. Immortality without glory. The Dakota will likely never be replicated. Modern architecture does not allow for such contradiction. Openness paired with isolation, luxury paired with silence, prominence paired with refusal. It belongs to a moment when buildings were allowed to have personalities, when they were not just functional, but philosophical. Its immortality does not come from beauty alone, or tragedy alone, or fame alone. It comes from presence. From standing where it has always stood, from refusing to disappear, from being more than the sum of its stories. The last word the building never speaks. The Dakota does not conclude its narrative. It does not offer resolution. It waits. While the city continues to change, while towers rise and fall, while names fade and trends pass, the Dakota remains, quietly watching from the edge of Central Park. Not demanding attention, not seeking forgiveness, not asking to be understood, just standing. And in a city that never stops moving, that may be the most powerful statement of all.